Yesterday, I read one of Abby Whittier's stories, which I feel is clearly a precursor to A Christmas Carol. By definition, if she wrote it, and I can prove that she wrote it beyond a reasonable doubt, it had to have been written before A Christmas Carol was published. Now, today, I'm going to read one of Mathew Franklin Whittier's stories where the history is a little bit more cloudy. I can prove that Matthew probably wrote it very early, sometime between 1828 and 1830, likely. And he would have been in his mid to late teens, like 16 to 18. And it's a very, very close match with A Christmas Carol, written many years before. I think it's one that they used when they collaborated, that they went back to this one and a few others. But first, I want to talk about a few things that are going on currently. A couple things to report. You may know, if you've kept up with this, that I sent out up to 600 emails, personalized emails, where I had a paragraph where I would address their particular interests and the relevance. And then sometimes I would just go off script completely and just write a personal email. So we're talking 3 days worth of solid work. And I was referring these people to a paper that I had hosted on Academia EDU. Well, live and learn, you know. But what happened was that those went out on the weekend. And presumably a lot of these people would have picked this up when they got in the office Monday morning. What happened was I started messaging people inside Academia EDU, and it shuts you down at 10. It'll only allow you to message 10 people who aren't like part of your internal network, whatever that is. And then it says you're only allowed 10, but it does say you're allowed 10, see? And I did that for 3 days. The third day, I only messaged 2 people, and suddenly my account was frozen. As of Monday morning, my account is frozen, and nobody can see the article. They get a 404 error. A friend of mine checked it. So that means that of the 600 people that I emailed over 3 days of solid work, perhaps 300 of them got a 404 error and probably never checked back. Utter disaster. And usually I keep pretty even keeled about things, but it was hard for me to take that, you know, with any kind of equanimity. I tried, but it was an unmitigated disaster. And it was partly my fault. I should have known that, I guess, all of these organizations are so freaked out by spam that they have clamped down, see? And of course, like everything else, when the crooks cause people to clamp down, everybody else gets clamped down along with them. So they apologized to me. They did take care of it by about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is late enough that all those 300 people would have given up on it. So I went into cosmic sour grapes mode and decided that maybe there was a purpose to it and that it really wasn't so bad after all. And here's what I came out with. First of all, I've learned from looking at the stats of how many pages people read of this article, because I get very detailed stats in Academia EDU. And among other things, it tells me how many pages people have read. Well, usually it's 2, maybe up to 7. You know, I've talked about that. A few people read the entire article. And a few people read 48 pages instead of 49. And that tells me something also, because the last page, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is not only the footnotes, but that's Abby's own writing. I'm quoting Abby's writing, which is really the glorious conclusion of the paper, to show you what Abby was like and how she could write. Well, if they only read page 48 and they stop bothering to read when they get to Abby's writing, that also tells me something. But in the future, what I'm going to do is, when I send out emails, and I'm going to do one for Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven in maybe 4 months, 3 or 4 months, 3 months, I'll have 2 download links. One is off of my server and one is off of Academia EDU. And secondly, I won't bother to message anybody inside of Academia EDU for at least a week anyway, you know, give other people a chance to look at it so I won't get shut down, see. So that's one of the things that happened. I think that here's where I was going with it. There's a very small percentage of people who are really interested. Those people will read the entire paper. Nobody else will. Everybody else will read 2 pages and get nothing out of it except maybe just a concept. Well, those people have already gotten the concept from the title because the title tells the whole story. So regardless of who read the paper, roughly 600 people are on notice that Mathew and Abby Whittier wrote A Christmas Carol before Charles Dickens got a hold of it and reworked it. They already got the message. See, that's all they would have gotten anyway. Those people. On the other hand, the people that read 49 pages, the entire paper, they'll get a 404 error and say, well, I'm going to check tomorrow. I'm going to look this guy up on the internet and find his website. They'll pursue it. So really nothing's lost because the people that would have read it will pursue the matter. The people that would only have read 2 pages have already got the message. So actually it doesn't matter. That's my cosmic sour grapes. Now, the second thing that happened was that I got on a Facebook group, and I have to be a little bit careful because these people will know themselves if they ever watch one of these. And I don't want to be disparaging. It's actually amusing to me in the end. It's real cosmic humor, But what happened is I got on this Facebook group about A Christmas Carol. It is not about Charles Dickens. These are not fans of Charles Dickens officially. They're fans of A Christmas Carol. And it's just assumed, of course, that it was written by Charles Dickens. So the first thing I did to get on there was to get on there and share with them by pictures my antiquarian copy of A Christmas Carol. And shall I go get it? Maybe I will, and I'll edit out my interim. Here we go. I've got a reprint that you can order for, I don't know, it didn't cost me very much, $20, something like that. This is a replica of A Christmas Carol, and it has a preface and an introduction. Of course, it's all assumed to have been written by Charles Dickens, naturally. And here we are. That's what it originally looked like. This is I believe it's supposed to be 1844 copy. It's been rebound in the old marble binding. And somebody has refurbished it, which is to say where certain pages were missing or they weren't any good, they replaced them with what look like modern replicas, except that these pictures are much sharper than in the replica that I purchased for 20 or 30 bucks. And then you have the original copy, which looks like that. And I have at least one, maybe 2 original illustrations. Let's see if I can find that. Here's an original illustration. It's not the only one. I'll put it up to the camera. So I shared that. And everybody liked it, of course. I don't know, 13, 14, 18 people in the group. They all thought that was wonderful, which I do also. And then I introduced my paper with a link. Well, quite a few people looked at it, but of course, I guess they were shocked and they only read 2 pages. As soon as they saw the way that I was manhandling, the memory of Charles Dickens, because I think he was absolutely a scoundrel, and the history bears me up on that. Well, they were out of there. They read 2 pages. They were offended. And the head of the group was offended. And I very politely reminded him that this was a group about A Christmas Carol. And I was as much of a fan of that story as anybody else in the group. And he was pacified for the moment. Meanwhile, there was a professor, I think he was Canadian, if I remember correctly. Anyway, there was a professor, I think an active professor, who read the article. Now, I have to go back and say that there was somebody that was very much against what I had said, and she said she had read it. Well, here's the thing. I knew that all these people from Facebook had only read 2 pages because I had the stats, and it tells me they come from Facebook, and it tells me they read 2 pages. So I knew that she had not read it. So I asked her, well, how many pages did you read? And then she came back with something off tangent, see? So then the professor steps in and says, after a day or 2, I think, and says, I've read the entire article. And I didn't check to try to, see if he really had or not. I'm just assuming he did, because there's about 6 or 7 people that did read the entire article. And he says, he wasn't impressed particularly. And he gave me a little lecture on how one really analyzes historical literature, if one does it right. And it's all style. They all want to go with style analysis. And I told him that's the weakest of my proof is style analysis. And I told him why. But he did grudgingly admit that there was one piece of evidence that he was impressed with. And that's the fact that in at least two of Mathew Franklin Whittier's early works, one of which I'm going to read to you today, the ending is very suspiciously similar to the next to last paragraph in A Christmas Carol. Well, he still spoke in terms of that being Dickens' paragraph. And I reminded him, I said, that's not Dickens' paragraph. That's Mathew Franklin Whittier's paragraph, versions of which he had used twice before. They just can't they can't wrap their mind around this concept. It's like a huge paradigm shift to get that Dickens was not the original author of this thing. But I have to say that, before I got on here to start this one, the analogy came to mind. Saying that there's only one thing in that article that impressed him is like somebody that sees Elizabeth Taylor and is not impressed. And then, parallel to reading the entire article, he now goes back and sees Elizabeth Taylor nude. And he likes her nose. That's all, She's a nice nose, Well, that's either crazy or it's dishonest. One of the two. You can't honestly, look at Elizabeth Taylor naked and just say, well, her nose is okay. It doesn't make any sense. Never mind, your belief system or anything else. It's not rational, So I get a lot of this. This is what I get from the scholars. A, I should stick strictly to textual comparisons and analysis. And B, there's, I'm not impressed. No wow factor, and this guy, because this last piece of evidence is so strong, he had to admit that maybe this was kind of interesting, see, and they'll use language like that, interesting. So this is what you get. And what it means is that no matter your training, no matter your IQ, you can still go into denial just like anybody else. And here's the truth. First off, I understand, I totally understand. Robert Almeter, a philosopher at the Georgia State University, whom I interviewed, told me that with regard to reincarnation in Dr. Ian Stevenson's work, that it was like somebody tells you that your brother is a murderer. You can't remain logical in that situation. You have to kick it out. There's something in you, like the lizard brain or whatever, that kicks it out, no matter how smart you are, however much training, unless you are very strongly trained and very strongly committed to being rigorously honest, which I have tried very hard to train myself to be. You have to have that kind of dedication to the truth above all else. And then you might not kick out information that's totally threatens your paradigm. Well, what happened with this group is that this guy pressed me. This is the other thing that I totally expect from scholars is you've got to get reincarnation out of it. You can't muddy the waters. And that was this fellow's term. You can't muddy the waters with reincarnation. Well, I expect this, of course. And the whole purpose of this thing is to keep reincarnation in the discussion. In other words, instead of academia saying, well, we might listen to you if you take reincarnation out, what I'm saying is I'm going to force you to bring reincarnation in. So I didn't tell him in that words. What I told him was that, that nobody else has found this without past life memory. It was because of past life memory that I was able to ask the right questions and go in the right research directions and actually come up with this. It's because I started with the solution that I was able to backtrack it, to solving the problem. Well, and in the course of that, standing up for myself, I said, I'm MFW's reincarnation. Well, that was too much, of course. And the next time I checked to see if anybody else had answered, I've been kicked out of the group. No warning, no explanation, nothing. I was out. See, that was it. And I think that the moderator was concerned. He doesn't want any controversy. And I was being very polite, but I am controversial, just existentially, see, just being myself, I'm controversial. So therefore, I was summarily dismissed, and I didn't pursue it. But the amusing part of it is that they have ejected one of the original co-authors of A Christmas Carol from their Christmas Carol group. They'll see it someday. Now, I want to read this story to you, and I have to get a little bit into the background. This is, in my better of two copies, The Three Brides, Love in a Cottage, and Other Tales, or Other Stories, I think it's called, and Other Tales, right here. Get past there's nothing on the front, it's just the spine. This is signed Francis A. Durivage. It was published in 1853. Here, let's see if I can show you the title page. I should be able to do that on these smaller books. There we go. And I don't know if it gives a publication date, but the very last story, which is about New Year's, I think Matthew wrote that in 1830, something like that. It's very much his style from 1830 about the new year coming in. And Durivage just tacked on 1853 instead of 1830 or whatever it originally was. So we know it was published in 1853 for sure. I know that this story was written by Mathew Franklin Whittier because I have spent a great deal of time proving the following extrapolated scenario, which I'll go through very, very briefly. It would seem that Mathew ghost wrote for Francis Durivage starting in 1835 with a historical encyclopedia, which I have a copy of. I won't go get that. And then he wrote at least 3 novels, kind of swashbuckling adventure novels. Ghost wrote them for Durivage. Mike Martin is about The Last of the Highwaymen. It's, about a gentleman robber, like the last one, supposedly. A topic which Matthew was kind of fascinated with. I found that first before anything else. I said, this is definitely Matthew's style. I knew it. And then I found 2 more that he ghost wrote for Durivage, and there might have been other ones, because late in the 1800s, there are some of these dime novels that show up under Durivage's name, which are also definitely written by Mathew, by style. And whether they were ghost written early or whether they were part of Mathew's portfolio, which I'll get in a minute, I don't have any way of knowing, but it's Mathew's work. Around 1848, sometime in 1848, Francis Durivage, and this is extrapolated, I won't keep saying extrapolated, but understand that what I'm about to say is a scenario that I've developed based on a great deal of evidence. He approached Mathew with a partner, and the partner was the moneybags of the outfit. That was George P. Burnham, George Pickering Burnham, and Francis Alexander Durivage. They approached Mathew with a proposition, and that proposition was to take Mathew's portfolio and select certain items from it, and Mathew would presumably sign off on that, and they would publish those things under their own names. And this was all unpublished work going back to 1828, 1830, and you can tell because Mathew's work evolved over time, and in particular, his early work has some racial stereotypes in it, which we'll see in a minute. It's not that he was cruel with it, but it was part of his culture. In 1830, there was an awful lot of ethnic slurs and things like that that were just normal. And Mathew, although he didn't feel the misogyny and hatred towards other racial and ethnic groups that his culture did, nonetheless, he was embedded in his culture, and he would kind of assume the stereotypes and the language and so on early on. Not long after that, in the mid-1830s, when he married Abby Whittier, he dropped all of that. For one thing, he stopped imitating Black dialect and making any fun of Black people, because he knew that the pro-slavery people would use that for their own purposes, and that the best way I can put it is to say that they would laugh at Mathew's humor with much more hatred than he had put in it. Let's put it that way. And other things like that he was more careful with after the early 1830s. So there are, in the material that Francis Durivage and George Burnham swindled Mathew out of, There's some of his early work which shows these characteristics, and that's how I know that this portfolio goes way back to at least 1830. So what they did is they tricked Mathew, apparently, into signing a contract, the small print of which gave them complete rights to publish the entire portfolio under their names, which they proceeded to do. First, they did it piecemeal in at least two, I think more publications, but at least two newspapers. The Flag of Our Union, and then Gleason's Pictorial, and the Spirit of the Times, I think were three actually that they published in. And then they made compilations. Each of them made their own compilations, and Durivage made a couple which include, one of them includes some pieces that were claimed by Burnham and some by himself. This has, I think, all Durivage's. But all of this, with a couple possible exceptions, is Mathew's work. I think the title one, Three Brides, I think that was Durivage's because it's kind of mean, and Mathew was never mean, see? So, and Durivage, by my lights, was a sociopath, and Burnham was a criminal, So Durivage published this work, and in it are some stories, like two or three, which are precursors to A Christmas Carol. And this one in particular, I know, was taken from the early portfolio because the villain is named Israel Worm, W-U-R-M, which is clearly an ethnic slur, which Mathew never would have used later on. That's the precursor to Ebenezer Scrooge. I'm not just blowing smoke about how close this is. I am not going to interpret, just like yesterday. I'm not going to interpret in line while I'm reading at all. I'm going to let you see the parallels. I've pointed out some of the crucial ones, not necessarily all, in my paper. So if you want to see my analysis of this thing, you can read my paper. I'm just going to read you the story, and you can find the parallels yourself. This is somewhat longish. It's called The New Year's Bells. How the wind blew on the evening of the 31st December in the year, but no matter for the date. It came roaring from the north, fraught with the icy chillness of those Hyperborean regions that are lost to the sunlight for 6 months, the realm of ice-ribbed caverns and snow mountains heaped up above the horizon in the cold and cheerless sky. On it came, that northern blast, howling and tearing and menacing with destruction every obstacle that crossed its path. It dashed right through a gorge in the mountains and twisted the arms of the rock-rooted hemlock and the giant oak, as if they were the twigs of saplings. Then it swept up over the wild waste meadows, rattling the frozen sedge and whirling into eddies the few dry leaves that remained upon the surface of the earth. Next, it invaded the principal street of the quaint old village and played the mischief with the tall elms and the venerable buttonwoods that stood on either side like sentinels guarding the highway. How the old gilt lion that swung from the signpost of the tavern, hanging like a malefactor in irons, was shaken and disturbed. By the way, that's a relic from a previous era. That's not 1853, that kind of tavern with that kind of swinging sign. There was one in Abby's village. Backwards and forwards the animal was tossed like a bark upon the ocean. Now he seemed as if about to turn a somersault and circumnavigate the beam from which he hung, creaking and groaning dismally all the while, like an unhappy soul in purgatory. The loose shutters of the upper story of the tavern chattered like the teeth of a witch-ridden old crone. But cheerful fires of hickory and maple were burning within doors. A merry group was gathered in the old oak parlor, and little recked the guests of the elemental war without. In fact, they knew nothing of it, till the driver of the village stagecoach, making his appearance with a few flakes of snow on his snuff-colored surtout, announced, as he expanded his broad hands to the genial blaze, that it was a wild night out of doors. But on sped the wild wind, driving the snowflakes before it, as a victorious army sweeps away the routed skirmishers and outposts of the enemy. Away went the night wind on its wild errand, reaching at last a solitary cottage on the outskirts of the village. Here it reveled in unwonted fury, ripping up the loose shingles from the moss-grown roof tree and forcing an entrance through many a yawning crevice. The scene within the cottage presented a strange and painful contrast to the interior of most of the comfortable houses in the flourishing village through which we have been hurrying on the wings of the cold north wind. The room was scantily furnished. There were 2 or 3 very old-fashioned, rickety, straw-bottomed chairs, an oaken stool or 2, and a pine table. The hour hand of a wooden clock on the mantelpiece pointed to 11. A fire of chips and brushwood was smoldering on the hearth. In one corner of the room, near the fireplace, on a heap of straw, covered with a blanket, 2 little boys lay sleeping in each other's arms. Crouched near the table, her features dimly lighted by a tallow candle, sat a woman advanced in life, clad in faded but cleanly garments, whose hollow cheeks and sunken eye told a painful tale of sorrow and destitution. Those sad eyes were fixed anxiously and imploringly upon the stern, grim face of a hard-featured old man, who, with hat pulled over his shaggy gray eyebrows, was standing, resting on a stout staff, in the center of the floor. "So, you haven't got any money for me," said the old man in the harshest of all possible voices. "Alas, no, Mr. Worm. If I had, I should have brought it to you long ago," answered the poor woman. "I had raked and scraped a little together, but the sickness of these poor children, poor William's orphans, swept it all away. I haven't a cent." "So much the worse for you, Mrs. Redmond," answered the old man harshly. "I've been easy with you. I've waited and waited, trusting your promises. I can't wait any longer. I want the money." "You want the money? Is it possible? Report speaks you rich." "It's false, false," said the old man bitterly. "I'm poor, I'm pinched. Ask the town people how I live. Do I look like a rich man? No, no. I tell you, I want my dues, and I will have 'em." "I can't pay you," said the woman sadly. "Then you must abide the consequences." "What consequences?" "I've got an execution, that's all," said the hard-hearted landlord. "An execution? What's that?" "A warrant to take all your goods." "My goods?" said the poor woman, looking round her with a melancholy smile. "Why, I have nothing but what few things you see in this room. You surely wouldn't take those." "I'll take all I can get." "And leave me here with the bare walls." "No, no, you walk out of this tomorrow. In the depth of winter, you cannot be so hard-hearted." "We shall see that." "I care not for myself, but what is to become of these poor children?" "Send them to work in the factory." "But they are just recovering from sickness. They are too young to work. Oh, where can we go?" "To the poorhouse," said the landlord fiercely. The poor woman rose, and approaching the landlord's feet, fell upon her knees, clasped her hands, and looked upward in his stern and unrelenting face. "Israel Worm," she said, "has your heart grown as hard as the nether millstone? Have you forgotten the days of old Lang Syne? Oh, remember that we were once prosperous and happy. Remember that misfortune and not sin has reduced me and mine to the deplorable state in which you find us. Remember that my husband was your early friend, your schoolfellow, your playmate. Remember that when he was rich and you poor, he gave you from his plenty, freely, bountifully, not gave with the expectation of a return. His gifts were bounties, not loans." "Therefore I owed him nothing," said the obdurate miser, turning away. "You shall hear me out," said the woman, starting to her feet. "I ask for a further delay. I ask you to stay the hard hand of the law. You profess to be a Christian. I demand justice and mercy in the name of those sleeping innocents, my poor grandchildren, whose Father is in heaven. You shall be merciful." "Heyday!" exclaimed the miser. "This is fine talk, upon my word. You demand justice, do you? Well, you shall have it. The law is on my side, and I will carry it out to the letter." "Then," said the outraged woman, stretching forth her trembling hand, "the curse of the widow and the orphan shall be upon you. Sleeping or waking, it shall haunt you, and on your miserable deathbed, when the ugly shapes that throng about the pillow of the dying sinner shall close around you, our malediction shall weigh like lead upon you, and your palsied lips shall fail to articulate the impotent prayer for that mercy to yourself which you denied to others. And now be gone. This house is mine tonight at least. Afflict it no longer with your presence. Go forth into the night. It is not darker than your benighted soul, nor is the north wind one half so pitiless as you. With a bitter curse upon his lips, but trembling and dismayed in spite of himself, Israel Worm left the presence of the indignant victim of his cruelty and turned his footsteps in the direction of his home. His home, it scarcely deserved the name. There was no fire there to draw his chilled and trembling frame, no light to gleam athwart the darkness and send forth its pilgrim rays to meet him and guide his footsteps to his threshold. No wife, no children waited eagerly his return. It was the miser's home, dark, desolate, stern, and repulsive. Its deep cellars, its thick walls held hidden stores of gold and notes and bonds, but there were garnered up no treasures of the heart. The miser's path lay through the churchyard, a desolate place enough even in the gay noon of a midsummer day, now doubly repulsive in the wild midnight of midwinter. The wall was ruinous. The black iron gateway frowned, naked and ominous. The field of death was crowded with headstones of slate, and innumerable mounds marked the resting place of many generations. The snow was now gathered fast over the dreary and desolate abode, as the miser stumbled along the beaten pathway, bending against the blast and drift. A strange numbness and drowsiness crept over him. He no longer felt the cold. An uncontrollable desire of slumber possessed him. He sat down upon a flat tombstone and soon lost all consciousness of his actual situation. Suddenly he saw before him the well-known figure of the old sexton of the village, busily occupied in digging a grave. The winter had passed away. It was now midsummer. The birds were singing in the trees, and from the far green meadows sounded the low of cattle and the tinkling of sheep bells. Even the graveyard looked no longer desolate, for on many of the little hillocks bright flowers were springing into bloom and verdure, attesting the affection that outlived death, and decorating with living bloom the precincts of decay. "My friend, for whom are you digging that grave?" asked Israel. The sexton looked up from his work, but did not seem to recognize the spokesman. "For a man that died last night. He is to be buried today." "Methinks this haste is somewhat indecorous," said Israel Worm. "Oh, for the matter of that," said the sexton, "the sooner this fellow's out of the way, the better. There's nobody to mourn for him." "Is he a pauper, then?" "Oh, no. He was immensely rich." "And had he no relations, no friends?" "For relations, he had a nephew who inherits all his property. The young dog will make the money fly, I tell you. As for friends, he had none. The poor dreaded him. The good despised him, for he was a hard-hearted, selfish, gripping man. In a word, he was a miser," said the sexton. "A miser," faltered the trembling dreamer. "What was his name?" "Israel Worm," replied the sexton. Graveyard and sexton faded away. In their place arose a splendid grove of trees, a clearing, a village schoolhouse. Two boys were sauntering along the roadside, engaged in serious, childish talk. One was fair with golden locks, the other dark-haired and grave of aspect. Israel started, for in the latter he recognized himself, a boy of 50 years ago. "Israel," said the golden-haired boy, "it's election day tomorrow. We'll hire Browning's horse and chaise and go to Boston and have a grand time on the common, seeing all the shows." "You forget, Mark," said the dark-haired boy sadly, "that I have no money." "What of that?" replied the other. "I have a pocket full, and what's mine is yours, you know. Come, cheer up. You'll one day be as rich as I am, and then it will be your turn to treat, you know. I can afford to be generous, and so would you be if you had the means." Then the shadow passed from the face of the dark-haired boy, and a smile lighted up his countenance, and the two schoolfellows passed on their way together. Grove and schoolhouse passed away, melting into another scene like one of the dissolving views. Israel stood before a huge illuminated screen in the midst of a gaping company of sightseers. He could see nothing but a confused mass of heads, vaguely lighted by the rays from that vast screen. It was some kind of an exhibition. "Now, ladies and gentlemen," said a strange voice issuing from the darkness, "we shall show you the wonders of the oxyhydrogen microscope, natural objects magnified 5,000 times. Look and behold the proboscis of a common housefly." Israel gazed with the rest, and soon a huge object, resembling the trunk of a monster elephant, appeared on the illuminated disk. It passed away. "Now, ladies and gentlemen," said the voice, "look well to the illuminated screen. What do you see now?" "Nothing," was the universal and indignant answer. "I thought so," replied the voice. "Yet you have before you a miser's soul magnified 5,000 times. 1,000,000 such would not produce an image on the screen." The illuminated disk grew dark and disappeared. Then a lurid light seemed to fill all space, and soon huge billows of flame rolled upward and writhed and twisted together like a myriad of gigantic serpents. Shrieks and howls of anguish issued from the fiery mass, but above all was heard the startling clangor of a bell. "Halloo, who's this?" cried a voice that evidently issued from a set of powerful human lungs. The miser felt himself roughly shaken by the shoulder and awoke. "What's the noise? Fire?" he asked, for the bell he had heard in his dream now jarred upon his waking senses. "Fire? No," said the man who had awakened him, the butcher of the village. "It's the boys ringing in the new year. By the way, I wish you a happy new year, Mr. Worm." "A happy new year, Mr. Worm," said the schoolmaster, for he too was present. "A happy new year," said Farmer Harrowby. "And a happy new year," chorused a dozen other voices. It was great fun wishing a miser a happy new year. "Thank you, neighbors. I wish you 1,000, replied Israel cheerfully. "How came you asleep there?" asked Farmer Harrowby. "Why, you might have perished in the drift." "I was overcome by drowsiness," answered Israel. "I was very cold. I'd been to make a call on Widow Redmond, and the poor soul was out of wood. By the way, Farmer, the first thing after sunrise, I want you to be sure to gear up your ox team and take a cord of your best hickory and pitch pine to the widow." "And who'll pay me?" asked the farmer doubtfully. "I will, to be sure," answered Israel. "Have I not got money enough? Here, hold your hand." And he put a handful of silver in the farmer's honest palm. "And you, Mr. Wilkins," he added, addressing the butcher, "take her the best turkey you've got, and half a pig, with my compliments, and a happy new year to her." "And how about that execution?" asked the constable, who was round with the rest, seeing the old year out and the new year in. "Confound the execution! Don't let me hear another word about it," said Israel magnanimously. "And now, neighbors," he added, "I owe you something for your good wishes. Come along with me to the Golden Lion, and I'll give you the best supper the tavern affords. Hurrah! New Year don't come but once in a 12-month. We will be bound that a merrier party never left the churchyard, even after a funeral, nor a merrier set ever sat down to a festal board than that which gathered to greet the hospitality of Israel Worm." In the course of the evening, an old Scotch gardener gave it as his opinion that the miser was fey. When a man suddenly changes his character, as when a spendthrift becomes saving, or a niggard generous, the Scotch say that he is fey, and consider the change a forerunner of sudden death. "No, my friend," said Israel, overhearing the remark, "I am not fey, and I mean to live a long while, heaven willing, for I have just learned that the true secret of enjoying life is to do good to others. I had a dream tonight which has, I trust, made me a wiser and better man. The miser lies buried in yonder churchyard. Israel Worm, a new man, has risen in his place, and as far as my means go, I intend that this shall be a happy new year to every one of my acquaintances." Israel was as good as his word, and never relapsed into his old habits. The widow and the orphan children were provided for by his bounty. He gave liberally to every object of charity. Hospitals, schools, and colleges were the recipients of his bounty, and when he died, in the fullness of years, the blessings of old and young followed him to his last resting place in the old churchyard, where he had dreamed the mysterious dream, and had been awakened to a better life by the pealing of the New Year's bells. Now, how much proof do you want? That's absolute flat-out proof. That's an absolute flat-out precursor to A Christmas Carol. No guess, no interpretation. You know, if Mathew Franklin Whittier wrote that, if it was written around 1830, and there's other very science fictionist stuff that Mathew wrote around that same time, which fits perfectly with this. You know, Mathew wrote science fiction about taking rockets to the moon and things like that. Well, this business with the microscope is just another example. If Mathew wrote this in 1830 and it wasn't published, and Francis Durivage turned around in 1853 and added it in his compilation, I don't know where and when it was published in a newspaper first. I don't believe I found it separately. It's flat out obvious that that's the story that Mathew built A Christmas Carol around. That was the scaffolding that Mathew built A Christmas Carol around. Abby came in with her understanding of metaphysics and of spirituality and added that to the mix. See, this isn't guesswork. The thing is that I've got too much evidence. I managed to get most of my evidence as a summary in 49 pages. And this is another thing that professor said, oh, it's general, it's too general. It's, well, it's general because I'm trying to cram in all my evidence in 49 pages. I couldn't put this entire story in. Had I been able to put this entire story in instead of just the last paragraph, I would have silenced the man, basically, because there's no argument to this. The only argument to this is stubbornness. And this isn't all the evidence I've got. That's not all the precursor stories I've got. That's just the best one from Mathew's side. It's the one I read yesterday is not the only one I've got from Abby's side. It's just a matter of being taken seriously. And then the other side is what would happen if people actually took me seriously. It could get interesting, to put it mildly. We'd either have people, wildly applauding, or we'd have people hatefully disparaging me. I don't know. I don't know that I want that. What I want is for Mathew's legacy to be properly attributed to him and to be put into a little library somewhere where people who are interested can come and learn about him and Abby and read their works and see the antiquarian copies that I've saved. But the only way I know to get from point A to point B is to go through this process of being shunned and ignored and then ridiculed, and then this huge hullabaloo that would happen if I got taken seriously, and then eventually coming down the other side where I have this little library established, that has enough funding to continue on into the future. I don't know any other way to get there. So that's all. We're at like 46 minutes. That's long enough. I don't know that anybody actually watches these all the way through, but if you have listened to me read this story, you know that there is an obvious, clear, indisputable precursor of A Christmas Carol written by Mathew Franklin Whittier when he was somewhere between 16 and 18 years old, when Charles Dickens wasn't writing basically anything. So there we have it. And I will continue to report what I've got now on Academia EDU. Before yesterday's disaster, I think there was something like 75 people that had touched upon it, and maybe 7 people who had actually read the entire article. Yesterday, there was like 8, because up until 3 o'clock, you couldn't access it. So whether any of those people will check back or not, or whether some of them didn't get their email until today, we will see. I think I lost a whole bunch of people, but again, they saw the title. So they're on notice. If they are intellectually rigorous, if they take it at all seriously, they'll find me. They'll come search for me, and I'm very easy to find online. I've got a notice on my homepage to go to the updates page, and there I have both download links, one from Academia EDU, which is now active, and one from my own website. So it's easily found if anybody has the slightest interest. and I will keep you updated.